Professor John Christy is no ordinary scientist. He was the lead atmospheric scientist for the International Panel on Climate Change. This is the IPCC. He's won the NASA Exceptional Scientific Achievement Medal for co-developing a satellite temperature record. And he's the director of the Earth System Science Centre at the University of Alabama. Now, he agrees the Earth's climate is changing, and it always has been. Temperatures rise, temperatures fall, as do sea levels. He says the climate is unmanageable, and by making energy more expensive, climate change won't stop. So before we go ahead and introduce a carbon dioxide tax in this country, which will see us not only pay more for petrol, electricity and everything requiring electricity, and cut thousands of Australian jobs, I thought we should check in with the likes of Professor John Christy. I've found him in an airport in Washington. Professor, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Are humans causing a catastrophic change in the system of climate?
You know, by looking at the evidence we have from satellites and so on, we do not see any dramatic or catastrophic changes at all.
But hold on a second. We have had, and we've been bombarded by government and various green groups in this country telling us that if we don't act now, we are doomed.
Well, I'm sure there are people who have something to gain by giving you that message, but we like to look at the hardcore data, the observations, and the facts of the climate system, and they just don't add up to make that case.
Many scientists seem to rely on temperature records. Is that a good indicator?
Well, we look at the temperature of the bulk of the atmosphere, so it's not confused by what might happen in cities and the countryside and so on at the surface. And by looking at the bulk of the atmosphere where the greenhouse effect is supposed to be large, have its largest effect, we just don't see much happening at all.
So temperatures taken on the surface of the Earth can be rather misleading, is what you're saying?
Yes, we have a number of papers on this, that when you build cities, roads, and I think the average person understands this, that inside a city it's a lot hotter than outside in the countryside. And so these thermometers do have problems in that regard.
I was under the impression, though, that the IPCC formed a consensus that evidence of global warming was unequivocal.
Well, I think they were talking about a very specific thing. Has the temperature of the planet warmed in the past 100 years? And that's true, it has. It's warmed a little bit. But remember, the climate, or the average temperature of the Earth, is never, ever static. It is always either going up or going down. And if it's just between you and me, I'll just say I'd prefer it going up rather than going down.
Why?
Well, when it goes down, we have ice ages that occur, and nobody wins in an ice age.
And so the increase in temperatures is nothing to be alarmed by. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, we're saying that the rate at which the temperature is rising right now, when you account for various things, is less than a degree per century.
What's your response to scientists who blame the recent spree of natural disasters and extreme weather events on climate change?
I would say look at the observations, and you will find these weather disasters have always occurred. You will find them in the history at various places and various times. It's just that we have the ability to record them on camera, video phones, and put them on YouTube, and that's what makes them so dramatic today, is because everyone can see around the world these events that are happening in very localized places.
Extreme weather conditions are part of the climate system, is what you're saying. What about the human output of carbon dioxide? Is this causing the planet to warm as well?
Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It will cause the planet to warm. What we found is that the rate of warming due to carbon dioxide must be pretty small because the Earth is not warming very rapidly.
How small?
I would guess on the order of 1 degree per century.
1 degree per century. So therefore, the output of carbon dioxide from man is nothing to be alarmed at either.
I don't think it's something to be alarmed at, and if you think of what you introduced the program with, is that trying to change the climate that's only warming at about 1 degree per century is almost impossible.
The current Australian government is about to introduce a tax on carbon in a bid to cut our emissions, our carbon dioxide emissions, by 5% by 2020. They want to go it alone. They don't want to wait for India, China or the United States. Are they achieving anything by doing this?
I would think a couple of things will happen. One is that your energy prices will rise and your economy then will begin to turn downward, and you will provide opportunities for other nations to take up the slack that Australia used to provide the world. But on the climate front, it will be imperceptible or minuscule compared to what the rest of the world is doing.
There was one scientist we've had, a fellow by the name of Tim Flannery, who's a paleontologist here and has been given the job of our climate commissioner in Australia. He's come out and said that if the entire world cut their carbon dioxide emissions immediately, the world together, that the temperatures won't be detectably reducing for 1,000 years.
Well, that's an interesting claim. I don't know exactly what he's talking about, but there is the point that additional emissions in the atmosphere are only going to add on to what is already there. And so the net effect of trying to change that growth of emission rates is going to be pretty small.
So we can't stop global warming, is what you're saying?
Well, I think when you say we, certainly not the developed countries of the world, because those countries that are in poverty, like China and India or so on, will not stop at anything to continue to develop and feed their people. And the simplest form of energy and the cheapest that they have is carbon, and so they are going to use it.
So from your analysis, are there any actions being considered by governments around the world that seem to be working when it comes to slowing the warming of the planet?
Yeah, that's right. I did an analysis. If the world built 1,000 nuclear power plants, and you and I both know that's not going to happen anytime soon, but if 1,000 new power plants were built, that would affect the climate by no more than 1/10 of a degree after 100 years. So the promotional aspects of all these legislative actions are just that. They're promotions. They're not going to actually do anything to emissions or whatever the climate's going to do.
California passed a law to reduce emissions by 26% by 2016. You did some research on what the impacts would be on global surface temperature as a result of adopting that rather radical law. What did you find?
Well, we find that we're talking about less than 1/100th of a degree. It's just so minuscule. I mean, the global temperature changes by more than that from day to day. So this is what we call in Alabama spitting in the ocean.
Yeah. I know you're not an economist, but what I fear most about this global warming scare campaign is the fact that our economies will go to rack and ruin. Am I fair in my assessment of what may happen to this country?
Yes, I think you are. I'm a state climatologist, and I deal with economic development issues all the time. And it turns out, one of the greatest benefits to humankind has come from energy, and cheap and affordable energy, accessible energy. I lived in Africa for a few years, and I can tell you that without energy, life is brutal and short. And so by making energy more expensive, less accessible, that means you're going to reduce your standard of living, and in so doing, you're really not going to help the planet.
In Australia, policy is dictated largely by lay people, that is people who don't have backgrounds in science. We've got an economist here called Professor Ross Garnaut, who's written a number of influential reports on climate change. He is urging immediate action before it's too late. Does their power and responsibility concern you in this debate?
Well, I'm, as an American citizen, concerned most about what happens in my country. But people who make those kind of claims, I think, are arithmetically challenged, that they don't sit down and take out the back of an envelope and calculate that when you reduce emissions by X amount, that what that possibly might mean to the climate, and they will see that these reductions are just not useful. You would want to reduce carbon emissions for many other reasons than the climate. You might think of the new sources of energy that are local to your economy or some reason like that, energy security. But to think you might change the climate, that's just not in the cards.
Australia is often quoted by the green groups here as being one of the Earth's largest emitters of carbon. From your research, is Australia high on the list of countries requiring urgent attention?
Well, Australia emits a lot of carbon because Australia makes a lot of things. This is something that perhaps some people don't understand, is that if you don't make things out of aluminum or you don't mine and extract things that other people in the world want, you don't have too many emissions. But when you do provide to the world so much of its resources, it takes energy, and we are grateful the rest of the world should be thanking Australia for providing so many natural resources that we use.
Someone has to be the energy bowl of the world, don't they?
Yes, my state here in Alabama is actually an energy exporter, and yet it counts against us in our emissions, even though we provide energy to other states.
Will we get into a cooling period at some time in the future? Will it reverse?
Well, the climate always warms and cools, so I don't know. I'm not very good at forecasting, but what I would come to the point of saying here is that a catastrophic warming, it doesn't look like it's in the future at all.
Do you think there's a guilt campaign going on at the moment where, citizens of the world are being forced by green groups to feel somehow guilty because they emit carbon?
That's a good point about why are folks motivated to make these dramatic statements that aren't based really on the scientific evidence. And there is kind of a social religious aspect to it that they think, the planet does need salvation from evil human beings. I happen to think life is precious on the planet, so I look at energy as a real enabler of making human life better and longer.
We've had a Prime Minister here say only a week or so ago that all of the world's reputable scientists agree that there is global warming and man contributes to that warming and we have to do something about reducing our carbon emissions.
Well, I think what he's done is just defined what he means by reputable, that if you agree with his point of view, then he would classify you as reputable. But I don't know if he has the same kind of reputation that people like me, and there are many others who have pretty good records in this industry.
I'm heartened by what you're saying, but I still feel that countries such as Australia are in for a torrid time if some of our leaders are being brainwashed into thinking that we're somehow evil in our carbon emissions.
Well, I think you should always, Australia is a democratically accountable society, and I think you should always have hope that the common person can figure these things out and know when they smell a rat, and that if your economy starts going into the tank, that the people will want changes and access to energy that is affordable for them.
I thank you very much for your time, Professor. I know you're in an airport and a difficult place to speak to me from, but thank you once again for your time.
Okay, my pleasure.
Okay, Professor John Christy. That's what he said. We'll be spitting in the ocean. Australia's economy will tank. And if the Prime Minister, from what I heard from John Christy, wants to destroy this country, she's going about it in the right way. To think we can change the climate, he says, is naive. There will be no catastrophic warming. He says he'd rather have a planet that was warming than getting colder, because in Ice Age no one wins. Listening to all of that was Senator Barnaby Joyce. He's been following what John Christy has had to say over the past few years, and he's quoted him at last week.